Hi, this is Charley Hesse from Tropical Birding, and welcome to this virtual bird tour of Japan in winter. I lived in Japan for 5 years. I speak fluent Japanese. I go back every year and it's almost like a second home to me. It's a fantastic tour. Physically it's pretty easy because it's winter, the days are not too long. It's a lot of fun. There's some fantastic photographic opportunities. There's plenty of exposure to Japanese culture and some great food as well. It's a tour in 3 sections. We start on the main island of Honshu, and then we go up to the northern island of Hokkaido, and then finally down to the southern island of Kyushu. Okay, we're going to start the tour in Tokyo and first driving up to the Japanese Alps. On the way, we're going to stop to look for the rare Pallas's rosefinch, which is a Northeast Asian endemic bird. Some Japanese photographers have set up a feeding site there, and it's a wonderful opportunity to pick up this beautiful bird. It's really one of the most beautiful rosefinches in the world, in my opinion, with this lovely streaky back and little silver flecks on the cheek and on the throat. Okay, we're going to move on to Karuizawa in the Japanese Alps in Nagano Prefecture. Some of you may remember that Nagano hosted the Winter Olympics many years ago. We stay in a hot spring hotel, and at the end of the day we can take a dip in the natural hot spring. There's an outdoor section to the hot spring, and it can be freezing cold outside and you're sitting in the hot water, and it's incredibly refreshing. When you come out of the hot spring, you can change into a Japanese outfit called a yukata, supplied by the hotel. This is a friend of mine that joined the tour a couple of years ago. You can go down to dinner in your yukata, where you're served a traditional Japanese meal. This is called kaiseki ryori, and you get up to about 10 different courses, and they're all beautifully presented, and it's quite the experience. This is an equally gorgeous breakfast here. You can see it snowed overnight. One of the nice things about this hotel is that there's feeders outside, and you can look out of the window from the hotel the heated hotel lobby and see some really nice birds. This is one bird that comes in. It's called the Eurasian jay. It's an interesting subspecies, and sometimes you even get a endemic Japanese squirrel. Okay, we're going to go out this morning. Sometimes you see this sign along the roadside warning you of giant flying squirrels. The local forest reserve has put up some boxes for these animals, and if you're lucky, sometimes you can see one poking its head out of the hole. Okay, we're going to take a walk in the forest. As you can see, there's lots of snow on the ground. We're going to be looking for the rare endemic copper pheasant. Sometimes when you walk through the snow, you get a copper pheasant hunkered down, and as you walk by, they burst out of the snow in a whir of wings. This year we actually found them on the forest ground, not in the snow. They're very difficult to see. They're very well camouflaged, and they don't move around much, so you have to try really hard to try and spot them. A bird we're much more likely to find is the Japanese green pheasant, which is a national bird of Japan. This is found in more open habitats and fields. Okay, after a couple of days in Nagano, we're going to move on to the Snow Monkey Park, Jigokudani. It's a bit of a walk up from the parking lot. It's about a mile. It can be a little bit slippery, so I usually recommend people wear ice spikes or crampons. Sometimes on the way up we see something interesting, like this Japanese serau, which is like a big fluffy grey mountain goat. This is Jigokudani itself. Jigoku means hell, and Tani means valley, Hell Valley, and it's named after the plumes of steam that come up from the natural hot springs. When we get up to the top, we'll see these snow monkeys. They're very famous for coming down to the natural hot springs there to keep warm in winter. And you can see groups of them sitting together grooming. You sometimes get some aggression between monkeys, especially the young males, and this can create some really fantastic photo opportunities. One of the things you don't see in the photographs are the crowds of tourists. It's a very popular tourist attraction, but it's still very worthwhile. I took a little bit of footage of some young monkeys playing in the snow across the valley, and they're just wonderfully playful. You can see them here wrestling and climbing up trees and sliding in the snow together. Yeah, it was a really fun thing to watch. You often see monkeys grooming each other next to the hot spring, which is quite a common behavior to watch. You can see one's found a little tasty treat there. Here's a young Japanese macaque sitting inside the hot spring that you can see she's chewing there. They sprinkle some grain inside the water, and they pick it out and just chew on it. It helps keep the monkeys in the water a little longer for the tourists. Okay, we're going to move on to the western Honshu wetlands. It's a real hotspot for waterfowl. You get big flocks of Buick swans there in the flooded rice fields. Those of you from North America will recognize this as a tundra swan, which is a real rarity in Japan. There's also a lot of geese. These are greater white-fronted geese, and we drive around the rice fields looking for these big flocks. There's a visitor center there at a place called Kata no Kamoike, and there's a large lake that we can scan for several interesting waterbirds. This is the tundra bean goose. There's also over 1,000 bicol teal which winter there every year. Sometimes we get a male smew, and also this beautiful duck, which is one of my favorites, a falcated duck. One of the great things about the western Honshu wetlands are the rarities that it draws in. Every year something mega shows up. A couple of years ago we had this swan goose, and we've also had oriental stork, a bird which was extirpated from Japan. It used to be found all over the country, but a change in rice cultivation meant that it was wiped out. We've also had this fantastic scaly-sided merganser, which is another endangered species, and this mega critically endangered Siberian crane. We don't, of course, get all of these birds every year, but there is always something interesting that shows up. Okay, so we're going to fly back to Tokyo, and sometimes we see Mount Fuji from the plane window. Okay, so back to Tokyo, and then we're going to fly on up to Hokkaido in the north, to Kushiro Airport, from where we're going to drive along the coast to the Nemuro Peninsula, and then up to Lake Furen and Raosu, and then finally back to Tsuruimura. We start with a boat ride looking for alcids. We do a few boat rides on this trip, but most of them are close to shore and for shorter periods of time, just an hour or two. So I'm prone to a bit of seasickness, but I usually do fine. It's freezing cold. Sometimes even the snow can freeze a little bit, but the alcids don't seem to mind. This is the most common, the spectacled guillemot. We can also see sometimes pigeon guillemot, ancient murrelet, and even sometimes some rarer alcids like this crested auklet. Another great place to bird along the coast are the fishing ports. When they don't freeze, they attract lots of sea ducks, like this red-breasted merganser, black scoters, and even harlequin ducks. They're also a good place for gulls, like this glaucous gull and glaucous winged gull. We also bird some peninsulas. There's one called the Nemuro Peninsula and another the Notsuke Peninsula. And from these peninsulas we can look over at the southern Kuril Islands, which used to be owned by Japan, but are now controlled by Russia. Along the end of these peninsulas you get some pretty rugged coastlines and cliffs. One of the birds we look for here is the red-faced cormorant. You can see the two cormorants on the right here. I've got very thin bills, and then the one on the left has got a slightly thicker yellow bill. This is a red-faced cormorant in winter plumage. There's hundreds of pelagic cormorants, but only a couple of red-faced cormorants, bit of a rarity. Another thing that we have seen is the Ross's gull, which you can find along these peninsulas. This is another great little bird. This is called the Asian rosy finch. It's a beautiful male with pink in the wing. It's a really hardy passerine, and it feeds on these open areas on little seeds. It can also be a good place for mammals. There's a very vibrant coloured red fox on Hokkaido, which is very beautiful. Sometimes you also see sika deer, stags sparring in the snow. This is a doe with a young deer in the forest, and we're going to move into the forest now. There's also some nice forest birding on Hokkaido. Sometimes we see this Eurasian red squirrel, this local dark subspecies. Hokkaido was connected fairly recently in the recent ice ages to continental Asia, so the wildlife there is much more similar to Russia than it is the rest of Japan. Also in the forest we can see things like great spotted woodpecker, marsh tit, coal tit, and also this beautiful race of long-tailed tit with a fully white head. In eruptive years we sometimes see waxwings as well, like this Bohemian waxwing, and sometimes also Japanese waxwing, which has a nice red tip to the tail. Okay, we're going to go and look for one of the major targets of the tour, Steller's sea eagle. The local fishermen, they throw out fish for these to feed the eagles, and photographers come along and they give a donation to the fishermen, and then we get to take some fantastic photos. So these guys pull their frozen fish out onto the surface of the frozen surface of Lake Furen, and when they get out there, they start tossing all the fish around, and then large-billed crows and black kites, and then finally white-tailed and Steller's eagle come in to feed on them. They're absolutely enormous birds. One of the biggest eagles in the world, with like a 2.5 meter wingspan. They're absolutely enormous, and we get fantastic photo opportunities of them on the ice. You sometimes get some aggression between the eagles, and you can see two Stellers here fighting, having a dogfight, and they're just really dramatic scenes. It's absolutely fantastic. Once we had an eagle, it took a fish and then it flew up and dropped it, and another eagle swooped in and caught it in midair, and I managed to capture a photo of this. Another great way to see the Steller's sea eagles is from a boat from Rausu Harbour. We go up to the top deck of the boat, and they pull out onto the sea and start throwing fish onto the surface of the water, and all these eagles start coming down and grabbing the fish, and you can get just amazing photographs. It's really, for me, it's one of the top wildlife photography opportunities in the world. Even had like 2 birds swooping down. You get hundreds of chances of getting great photos of these amazing birds, and also great flight shots too. Sometimes, if you're lucky, the ice floe has arrived, and they throw out fish onto the ice, which gives you some different photos, which are also just fantastic. And this is one of my favourite photos, where it landed on a very sort of blue-coloured iceberg. This huge bird. Also, you can be lucky to see some sea mammals. This is a Steller's sea lion. As we pull back into the harbour, they'll throw some of the last fish out on top of the harbour wall, which is almost eye level with the top of the boat. And you can see this one eagle here was just incredibly close. But yeah, just amazing views of these awesome birds. And that day I managed to get a really nice close-up of Steller's. Okay, next we're going to go in search of another major target of the tour, which is the Blakiston's fish owl. This is a little statue of one in front of Kyushu airport. Okay, so we drive up into this secluded forested valley with a river that comes down. We're just inspecting the site here. There's a lodge, and they've made a little pool inside a river, and they put in live fish there. And at night, these huge owls come down to pick up the fish. You can see here there's a little spotlight that's been set up, so it means you can take photos. As we arrive, there's often a brown dipper that hangs around there. It's quite tame. I got some footage of this wonderful little bird diving into the ice-cold water in search of little invertebrates. But they're really hardy little birds, yeah. But yeah, very cool. We'll be watching the stream from these little prefab units. When we arrive, they give us a nice traditional Japanese meal. It was like hot pot and sushi, but there's always people who are not too adventurous in their tastes, and there's also a lot of other options for everybody. Once we finish dinner, they move the tables out of the way, and then we observe the stream from these sliding windows on the left. Sometimes it gets dark about 5 p.m. Sometimes as early as 5 or 5:30, you can get an owl coming in. Sometimes they come in much later, and you've got to wait many hours. But almost every night they do come in, so you just need to be patient. They're absolutely enormous birds. By far the biggest owl in the world, the heaviest owl with the longest wingspan. But they come down to the edge of the pond here, and then they sort of peer inside. And then when they spot a fish, they jump in and start flapping their wings around their huge 2 meter, over 6 foot wingspan, and feeling around with their feet for fish. And when they grab it, jump out and start sort of juggling it around a little bit, and then they pop it in its beak, and then they fly off up into the valley. Sometimes they go and feed their mate, and then they come straight back and get another fish. But normally sort of 2 or 3 times in the night they'll come back. For me, this is really one of the top wildlife viewing spectacles anywhere in the world. I mean, it's just an absolutely amazing experience and a real highlight of the tour. Okay, we're going to drive back to Kushiro, and on the way we stop at a little stakeout for Ural owl. We know a cavity where they usually sat there in the open, and also giving nice photo opportunities. Okay, next we're going to go looking for the Japanese crane, or the red-crowned crane. We go to a couple of different places looking for them. The first of which is a bridge over the Setsuri River in Tsurui-mura town, where we stay. We go there at dawn, and you can just see the sun starting to come up, and you get this beautiful soft light. There's a hot spring that flows into this river, which means that the surface of the stream doesn't get frozen, so that all the cranes come in and they roost in here overnight. And early in the morning, you sometimes get this wonderful steam coming off the water. As the light improves, you can see all these starting to move around and start their day. It's not a great video, but we can see some of the birds starting to sort of jump up and down and start their day, and it's just really a wonderful sight. These birds then fly off to some feeding sites. There's about 3 or 4 main feeding sites in Hokkaido, and they scatter grain on the surface of the snow, and the cranes come in and they spend a lot of their day just sort of pacing around. Here you can see them just sort of pacing around and feeding. Sometimes they'll be a little bit more animated and start doing some courtship and bugling. Sometimes you can be lucky and there'll be a crane that flies in and giving really nice opportunities to photograph these beautiful birds. When they land, they sort of strike these wonderful poses, and then they start sort of ruffling their feathers. This is what we really wanted to see. This is where they start strutting around in pairs and doing some courtship and bugling. It's a very atmospheric sight. And if we're really lucky, you sometimes get them jumping up and down in the snow and doing some courtship dances. One year we had this one bird, and it seemed particularly interested in doing some courtship, but it didn't seem to have a mate. So it was sort of doing a little dance on its own, and it was even sort of picking up a little piece of ice and tossing it up in the air, which was quite a funny sight. This is another bit of footage of one of the feeding sites. It had about over 100 birds here, and you can see they're a little bit more animated as birds sort of starting to move around and do some of their bugling and strutting. Yeah, they're incredibly graceful, stately birds, and there's just a real. It's just wonderful to see them like this. Okay, so that's the end of the Hokkaido section as well, and now we fly back via Tokyo down to the southern island of Kyushu. And we fly into Kagoshima Airport, and on the way in we can see this sort of little mini version of Mount Fuji called Sakurajima, which is one of the most active volcanoes in Japan. You can see smoke coming out of the top of it. We're going to drive up to a town called Izumi, where there's a big feeding site where there's up to 15,000 cranes that come in. The next morning we go at dawn, and we see these thousands of cranes flying from their roost sites to their feeding site, and it's just an absolutely amazing experience. I mean, it's been called one of the most underrated wildlife viewing experiences in Asia. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. You hear this cacophony of sounds as they're all circling around, and then they start to come down into the rice fields and then start walking towards the feeding site where we're waiting to take pictures. This city, Izumi, they probably go through about 20 bags of grain every day, and this goes on for months. So they've invested a lot in attracting these cranes, and as I say, there's about 15,000 of them, and they all gather on this road. I mean, it's just an amazing spectacle. Here's some footage of them feeding there. Yeah, it's just wonderful. The most common species is the hooded crane, and there's over, I think, 11,000 of these birds. The next most common is the the white-naped crane, which is much larger, and there's probably about 2,000 or 3,000 of those. There's a few other species with just a few individuals. This is a common crane, and there's even sandhill cranes. There's about 7 of them now, I think, and they come in every year. There's a crane observation center, which we're going to go and check out. There's a little sign here with a Eurasian kestrel perched up on top. This is a center here, and they have, and from the top floor, you can look over another feeding site that they have, and they have a lot of wonderful displays teaching you about the cranes, and then they also have a little running total down here of the number from the last count. There's lots of other good birds in the area. This is the Eurasian spoonbill, the northern lapwing, very attractive shorebird. There's also a lot of ditches and little creeks with that are sort of overgrown, and you can get some nice, some interesting rallids like this brown-cheeked rail and ruddy-breasted crake. As well as the thousands of cranes, there's also many other birds. There's tens of thousands of ducks and thousands of corvids as well, carrion crows and rooks, and mixed in with them you get a few individuals of this rare Dorian jackdaw. Okay, next we're going to drive up the coast a little bit to some mudflats and look for this very rare Saunders gull, which feeds on little crabs on the mudflats. Okay, now we're going to drive up into the mountains of Kyushu. We have a short cultural diversion at a nice temple called Kirishima Jingu. It's a beautiful place, and it's I can explain a little bit about temple visits and a little bit about Japanese culture. It's also surrounded by a beautiful forest, so you do get to do a bit of birding too. Okay, we're going to stay at a little lodge up in the mountains there, and they also have outdoor hot springs, which are really one of my favorite parts of the Japan tour. The next morning we're going to go to an old volcanic crater lake, which is surrounded by really nice lush evergreen forest. We're going to take a little walk inside the forest and hopefully see some forest birds. This is the varied tit, Eurasian nuthatch, red-flanked bluetail, Japanese pygmy woodpecker, and even the endemic Japanese green woodpecker. Some of the nearby rivers are great places to look for mandarin ducks. They're very shy, but we should be able to find some. Okay, now we're going to drive down towards the east coast of Kyushu and Miyazaki Prefecture, where we're going to get on a little boat. Again, this is it's just going just outside the harbour. It's usually pretty flat, and it's a fairly short boat ride, so don't worry. I never normally get seasick on this. The boatman just knows where to find our target, which is these Japanese murrelets. About 80% of the world population of Japanese murrelet breed off the coast of Miyazaki on small little islets. And we go out into the ocean, and we usually get pretty close to these beautiful little birds. They're like a little miniature penguin that sort of bobs on the surface and sort of dives down, but they're just incredibly charming little birds. Sometimes you also get chances to photograph them in flight. Okay, we're going to drive further south a little bit along the coast, and we're going to go to a little river mouth called Hitotsusegawa. Kyushu is a lot warmer than the rest of Japan at this time of year, and there's a lot more passerines around. This is a really beautiful one called the Dorian redstart. You also get things like meadow buntings and hawfinches. There's one individual of greater spotted eagle that comes in every year, and we know just where it roosts, so we're going to go and look for that too. There's also an important wintering population of black-faced spoonbills there. There's about 15 or 20 birds down here. Some of them have got their bills tucked away, but you can see this one preening at the back there, starting to get its breeding plumage with its nice crest and golden breast feathers. Sometimes we're lucky enough to find raccoon dogs, another very seldom seen mammal. I managed to get a bit of footage of one walking along the edge of a rice field, but yeah, that was a real mammal highlight of the tour. Next we're going to go for a little bit of sushi at the end of the day. I'm a big fan of sushi. We go to this conveyor belt sushi restaurant where you order sushi on the screen, and then it sort of comes around on a little conveyor belt. It's a lot of fun, and even if you're not too into sushi, there's usually a lot of other things like fried chicken and French fries and all sorts of stuff on offer. So yeah, there's usually something for everybody. Okay, so that's the end of the main tour. Those that are going to join us on the extension, we're going to get on a overnight ferry to an island called Miyakejima. Here we're pulling out of Tokyo Bay. The next morning we arrive on the island of Miyakejima, which is a very volcanically active island. We're going to head to another volcanic crater lake surrounded by beautiful forest. And there is a nature center here called Akakokkokan, named after the Izu thrush. The Japanese name is Akakokko. If we get there nice and early, we should be able to find one of these rare and endemic birds. Another endemic is this bird called the Austin's tit, which was split from varied tit recently, and is only found on these islands south of Tokyo. This is another wonderful bird that we look for called the Japanese wood pigeon. The Japanese name is karasubato, which means the crow pigeon, because it's a big black bird. We usually have a bit of spare time to look around the visitor center, and you can even dress up as an Izu thrush. Okay, we're going to get back on the boat, and we should have a few hours of sea watching on the way back. It's quite a big boat, and it's very stable, so yeah, people rarely get seasick on it. We're mainly looking for albatrosses. This is the Laysan albatross. Another one we can see is the black-footed albatross, and the main target is this very rare short-tailed albatross, a real huge and majestic bird. Anyway, that's the end of the tour. I hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, thank you very much for joining me.